Jean
My name is
Seberg was
Jean
not
Seberg.
destroyed by the kind of scandal Hollywood
Marshalltown,
usually
Iowa.
understands. There was no secret
November
film
5th.
set affair that ruined her overnight. No studio feud that buried her career in silence. No single bad role that made the public turn away. The wound was stranger than that. In one version of her story, Jean Seberg is frozen forever in Breathless, young, luminous, impossible to pin down, walking through Paris with cropped blonde hair and a face that seemed to belong to the future. But in another version, the one preserved in government files, she becomes something else entirely, a political target. A woman whose private life could be used. A pregnant actress whose reputation could be damaged. A public figure whose image, in the cold language of power, could be cheapened. That is the fracture at the center of Jean Seberg's life. The world remembered her as an icon of freedom. The FBI looked at her and saw influence. A young American actress, living partly in Europe, admired by intellectuals, photographed by magazines, connected to cinema, beauty, youth, and rebellion, and willing to support the Black Panther Party at a time when J. Edgar Hoover's FBI treated black radical politics as a threat to be neutralized. That word matters. Neutralized. It sounds bureaucratic, almost bloodless. But when it entered Jean Seberg's life, it did not stay on paper. It moved through surveillance, it moved through gossip. It moved through a story about her pregnancy, a story designed not simply to report, but to humiliate. And once that story reached the press, Jean no longer owned the most intimate parts of her life. The public did not see the machinery behind it. They saw a headline, a rumor, a whisper dressed up as news. They saw a glamorous woman suddenly surrounded by scandal and confusion, and many of them had no reason to know that the scandal may not have begun in Hollywood at all. That is what makes her story so disturbing. Jean Seberg was famous because the camera loved her. But the force that followed her was not a camera. It was a file. And a file can be colder than any spotlight. Before the government papers, before the smear campaign, before the pregnancy became a weapon in someone else's hands, there was a very different Jean Seberg. There was the girl America first tried to package as a discovery. There was the actress Europe turned into a symbol. There was the face that seemed to float above the old rules of stardom. She did not look like the Hollywood goddesses who came before her. She did not move like them. She did not carry the heavy glamour of the studio era. She seemed lighter, sharper, more modern, as if she had stepped out of the old system and into a new century before everyone else. In Breathless, she was not simply beautiful. She was unknowable. She sold newspapers on the Champs, Élysées, and looked at the world as if she might leave it at any second. That image became iconic because it felt effortless. A woman in motion, a woman who could not be contained. But that image also hid a dangerous misunderstanding. The public often loves a rebel, as long as rebellion remains aesthetic, a haircut, a cigarette, a way of walking through Paris. A screen persona that feels bold, but costs the viewer nothing. Jean Seberg's rebellion did not stay safely on the screen. She cared about politics. She gave money. She lent her name and attention to causes that made powerful men uncomfortable. And in the late 1960s, that was enough to change the way she was seen by people who did not care about cinema at all. To them, she was not Patricia from Breathless. She was not a face of the French New Wave. She was a famous white actress with access, sympathy, and visibility, standing too close to a movement the FBI was determined to break. That is where the fairy tale begins to darken, because Jean Seberg's story is not only about fame. It is about what happens when fame becomes evidence. When compassion becomes suspicion. When a woman known for being watched on screen begins to be watched in life. And the cruelest part is that the attack did not come directly at her work. It came at her image, not the actress, the woman, not the performances, the pregnancy, not the public achievement, the private body. The campaign understood something Hollywood had always understood. A woman's reputation could be damaged faster through shame than through argument. If you wanted to make her smaller, you did not need to defeat her ideas. You only had to make the public look at her differently. That is why Jean Seberg's tragedy still feels modern. It is not only a story about an actress from another era. It is a story about who gets to control a narrative once power decides a person is useful as a warning. For years, Jean had been looked at as a symbol of freedom. Then, quietly, behind closed doors, another story was being written about her. And by the time the world began to understand who had written it, Jean Seberg was no longer there to answer back. Before Jean Seberg became a file, she was a face. That was how the world first learned to understand her, not through long interviews, not through carefully controlled studio mythology, but through the almost shocking simplicity of her appearance. The short blonde hair, the open eyes, the small frame that seemed to carry more defiance than glamour. She did not enter cinema looking like a woman prepared to be worshipped. She looked like someone prepared to walk away. That made her different. Hollywood had always known how to manufacture beauty. It knew how to light a cheekbone, dress a body, soften an accent, invent a romance, erase a past. The studio system could build a goddess from almost anything, as long as she agreed to stand still. Jean Seberg never seemed built to stand still. Even before Breathless, there was something unsettled in her screen image. She had been discovered young, placed under the gaze of powerful men, and introduced to audiences before she could fully decide what kind of actress or what kind of person she wanted to become. In Saint Joan, she was presented as innocence and conviction. In Bonjour Tristesse, she appeared in a world of wealth, sunlight, and emotional cruelty. Those early films gave her visibility, but not yet a language of her own. Then came Paris. And with Paris came the role that would make her immortal. In Breathless, Jean Seberg did not look like a star trying to command the frame. She looked like a question moving through it. As Patricia, the American girl selling newspapers on the Champs, Élysées, she seemed casual, almost careless. She wore simple clothes. She moved through real streets. She spoke in a voice that did not sound polished for a palace of dreams. That was the spell. She did not seem sculpted by Hollywood. She seemed found. For audiences, that difference mattered. The French New Wave was breaking rules in the language of cinema: jump cuts, handheld cameras, improvisation, loose rhythms, endings that refused comfort. And Jean's face became part of that revolution. She became the image people could remember even if they forgot the theories. A woman in a striped shirt, calling out on a Paris avenue. A woman both near and distant. A woman who seemed to belong to modern life before modern life had fully arrived. But screen images are dangerous things. They flatten a person into something easy to repeat. Jean Seberg became cool. She became modern. She became the pixie haircut, the Paris walk, the look of youth unburdened by yesterday. Fashion could borrow her. Magazines could frame her. Film lovers could turn her into a symbol of artistic rebellion. But symbols are not allowed to be complicated for very long. The public liked the version of Jean that felt free but remained decorative. A beautiful American in European cinema. A stylish young actress who could make rebellion look effortless. A woman whose mystery could be admired from a safe distance. What the public saw less clearly was the pressure inside that image. Jean was not only a cinematic surface. She was a person trying to live with the consequences of being seen so intensely, so early, and so often through other people's fantasies. Hollywood had tried to define her. Europe had transformed her. Critics had interpreted her. Photographers had preserved her in poses that made her seem eternal. But eternity can be another kind of cage. The more famous her image became, the less room there was for the woman behind it to change without being misunderstood, and Jean did change. She moved between America and Europe. She worked across languages and film cultures. She lived in a world where art, politics, celebrity, and private conviction were beginning to collide. The 1960s did not allow anyone to remain untouched forever, especially not someone visible enough to be useful. That visibility was Jean's gift. It was also what made her vulnerable. Because fame gives a person a platform, but it also gives enemies a target. A private citizen can donate money quietly, attend meetings quietly, care quietly. A star cannot. A star's name travels faster than her intentions. A star's photograph can become evidence before she has said a word. And Jean Seberg's face, the same face that made her an icon, was now attached to choices that powerful institutions were watching. The first crack in the public image was not a failed performance. It was not age, or bad publicity, or the ordinary erosion of fame. It was politics. Jean began to appear not merely as a film actress, but as someone with sympathies, loyalties, and convictions beyond the screen. She supported civil rights causes. She gave attention and money to movements that were not fashionable in the safe, harmless way celebrity causes are often expected to be. Her support for the Black Panther Party placed her close to one of the most heavily scrutinized political organizations in America. To some, that may have looked like conscience. To the FBI, it looked like influence. That shift is crucial. Jean Seberg did not stop being beautiful. She did not stop being photographed. She did not stop carrying the aura of European cinema. But somewhere in the machinery of government, her beauty stopped being the main point. Her celebrity became leverage. Her politics became suspicion. Her private life became a possible weakness. And once a woman's private life is treated as a weakness, the next step is not difficult to imagine. The public still saw the actress from Breathless. The file saw a woman who could be pressured. This is where the story leaves the romance of cinema behind. Because the world that made Jean Seberg famous was built on looking, cameras looked at her, audiences looked at her, magazines looked at her. But the next gaze was different. It was not interested in making her luminous. It was interested in making her useful. Jean Seberg's danger, in the eyes of the FBI, did not come from a speech. It came from the collision of three things: fame, sympathy, and visibility. She was not a political leader. She was not organizing a party. She was not commanding a movement. She was an actress, but an actress whose name could open doors, attract attention, and make causes look human to people who might otherwise look away. That was the part power understood. A celebrity does not need to hold office to become useful. She only has to be seen standing near the wrong people, giving money to the wrong cause, expressing sympathy at the wrong historical moment. Once that happens, her image stops being harmless. And Jean Seberg's image had already traveled farther than she had. By the late 1960s, she was no longer only the girl from Iowa who had been lifted into stardom almost overnight. She belonged to a more complicated world: European cinema, American unrest, political argument, artistic circles, celebrity journalism, and a culture increasingly suspicious of anyone who refused to stay in the role assigned to them. For Jean, the role assigned to her was simple enough: be beautiful, be modern, be mysterious, be photographed, be admired, be the kind of rebel people could consume without being challenged. But conscience does not always remain photogenic. Jean gave support to civil rights causes. She showed sympathy toward groups and people that mainstream America often treated with fear. And when her support extended to the Black Panther Party, her celebrity took on a new meaning inside the government's machinery. The Black Panthers were not merely controversial in that era. They were under intense federal scrutiny. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI saw them not as a passing political disturbance, but as a profound threat to the established order. The Bureau's counterintelligence operations were built around words like disrupt, discredit, and neutralize, words that sound almost administrative until they are applied to a living person. Jean Seberg became one of those living people. The tragedy is that she appears to have entered this world not as a strategist, but as someone moved by conviction. That distinction matters. It keeps her human. She was not a mastermind of revolution. She was a public woman with private beliefs, and she made choices that put her reputation near a political fire. To some observers, that may have seemed naive. To others, it was brave. To the FBI, it was actionable. And the Bureau did not need to defeat Jean Seberg in a debate. It did not need to prove that her sympathies were dangerous in court. It only needed to make her name toxic enough that her influence would weaken. That is why her story turns so sharply here. Because once Jean became useful as an example, the attack did not have to be fair. It only had to work. In the public imagination, Jean still belonged to cinema. She still carried the shimmer of Paris, the memory of Breathless, the elegance of a woman who had somehow escaped the old Hollywood mold. But in the private language of surveillance, she was being reduced to vulnerability. Who did she know? Where did her money go? Whose causes did she support? What part of her life could be exposed, twisted, or made humiliating enough to isolate her? Those questions changed the nature of being seen. A movie camera looks for presence. A surveillance file looks for weakness. Jean had lived for years under the first gaze. She knew what it meant to be photographed, reviewed, desired, misunderstood, but the second gaze was different. It was not interested in her talent. It was not seduced by her beauty. It did not care whether she was luminous or lonely. It cared whether she could be damaged. And every public woman has a place where the culture is prepared to wound her. For some, it is age. For some, sexuality. For some, ambition. For some, motherhood. For Jean Seberg, the place power eventually found was intimate enough to feel almost unspeakable, her pregnancy. That was the cruelty of the method. It did not attack her politics directly. It did not tell the public, in plain terms, that Jean Seberg had supported a movement the FBI wanted to weaken. That might have made her look principled to some, controversial to others, but still coherent. Instead, the story moved toward shame. A rumor could do what an accusation could not. It could slide into gossip columns, hide behind suggestion, and let readers finish the dirty work in their own minds. It could turn a woman's body into a public question. It could make her seem unstable, immoral, reckless, or ridiculous without ever having to argue the politics underneath. That was the real violence of it. Not violence in the obvious cinematic sense. Not a gunshot. Not a chase. Not a man in a dark alley. Something quieter. A whisper placed where a headline could carry it. Jean Seberg's public image had been built on ambiguity. She was alluring because people could project meaning onto her. She was American and European, innocent and knowing, fragile and defiant. But now ambiguity was being used against her. The same space that once made her interesting could be filled with suspicion, and suspicion spreads faster than truth. It does not ask for documents. It does not wait for context. It enters the room before the person does and changes the way everyone looks at her. By then, Jean was caught in a contradiction almost impossible to survive cleanly. If she stayed silent, the rumor could harden. If she fought back, the scandal grew larger. If she explained herself, she was forced to discuss the most private part of her life in public. That is what it means to lose control of your own story. Not simply to be lied about, but to be pushed into a trap where every response feeds the thing that wounded you. For Jean Seberg, fame had once made her seem untouchable. Now it made the wound visible, and somewhere behind the public whisper was the cold paper trail of a campaign that knew exactly what it was trying to do. The document did not read like drama. That may be the most chilling part. There was no theatrical language, no obvious rage, no confession of cruelty, nothing that sounded, on the surface, like a villain explaining himself. It was administrative, controlled, written in the clean, distant voice of an office that had learned how to make harm sound like procedure. Jean Seberg was pregnant, and inside the FBI, that pregnancy became an opportunity. The Los Angeles office sent a communication up the chain, asking for permission to spread information about her private life through gossip columnists. The purpose was not hidden behind much softness. The idea was to cause her embarrassment, to make her image cheaper, to reduce the power of a woman whose name, beauty, and celebrity had made her useful to causes the Bureau wanted discredited. That is the point where the story crosses a line. Surveillance is one thing, already invasive, already frightening, but surveillance still suggests watching. This was not just watching, this was intervention. The Bureau had looked at Jean Seberg's life and selected the most vulnerable part of it. Not her film career, not a public speech, not a political statement that could be debated in daylight. Her pregnancy, a private, physical, emotional fact. A fact that should have belonged first to Jean herself. Instead, it was treated like material. Something to be placed. Something to be leaked. Something that could move through the press and do damage precisely because the public would not understand where it came from. That is why gossip was the perfect weapon. A government statement would have raised questions. A formal accusation would have required proof. A public campaign against a movie star might have made the machinery visible, but gossip could pretend to be casual. It could appear as a whisper from nowhere. It could arrive in a column, half-coded, half-clear, giving readers just enough to recognize the woman without giving them enough to see the hand behind the curtain. A blind item does not have to name you to wound you. Sometimes it wounds more efficiently by making everyone feel clever for guessing. For Jean Seberg, the attack was built on that cruelty. Her identity could be implied, her body could be discussed, her reputation could be shaken. And because the story came dressed as entertainment, many readers would never think of it as a political act. They would think of it as scandal. That was the genius and the ugliness of the method. It turned state power into a rumor. It turned a woman's pregnancy into a public puzzle. It turned ideology into shame. And for Jean, there was no clean way out. If she ignored it, the whisper remained. If she denied it, the story grew. If she tried to explain the truth, she would have to drag an intimate part of her life further into public view. Every path led back to exposure. That is the trap hidden inside reputational violence. It does not only say something about you, it forces you to live inside the question it creates. Who is the father? What kind of woman is she? What has she been hiding? Why is she involved with those people? The questions were not innocent. They were shaped by the politics of the moment, by racism, by sexual shame, by the old American habit of punishing women through reputation first and facts later. Jean Seberg had become famous in an era that loved to look at women. But this was a different kind of looking. The movie camera had made her image luminous. The gossip machine made it vulnerable. One turned her face into style. The other turned her life into a target. And the distance between the two was smaller than people wanted to believe. Because Hollywood had always depended on public fantasy, stars were built out of images, and images could be adjusted, softened, darkened, sold, protected, destroyed. Jean's image had once been marketed as modern innocence, the American girl in Paris, the uncatchable blonde, the face of a new cinematic freedom. Now the same public curiosity that had made her famous could be redirected against her. The audience that once wondered what she meant on screen could now be invited to wonder what she had done in life. And somewhere beneath that shift was the knowledge that a line in a government file had helped push the question into the world. This is the part of Jean Seberg's story that refuses to behave like ordinary celebrity tragedy. Many stars have been hurt by gossip. Many have had their private lives distorted by newspapers, columnists, and hungry readers. But Jean's case carries a darker charge because the smear was not simply born from public appetite. It was, according to the paper trail, encouraged by a federal operation that understood exactly how public appetite could be used. The Bureau did not need millions of people to read an FBI memo. It only needed them to read the rumor. Once the rumor entered circulation, it could do what rumors do best. It could detach from its source. It could become something people were saying. It could move from office to dinner table, from column to magazine, from suspicion to assumed truth. By the time anyone asked where it had begun, the damage would already have a life of its own. That is how a private wound becomes public weather. It surrounds you before you can point to it. For Jean, this was not only a political attack. It was an attack on personhood, on motherhood, on dignity, on the right to decide when and how the most intimate facts of your life are spoken aloud. The cruelty was not loud. It was designed not to be loud. It was designed to look like gossip, to sound like entertainment, to be consumed casually by people who would never think of themselves as participants in a campaign, but that is what made it so effective. The public did not have to hate Jean Seberg. They only had to look at her differently. And once that happened, the icon from Breathless began to disappear behind a story she had not written, could not control, and could not easily escape. Once a rumor enters the world, it becomes difficult to call it back. That was the terrible advantage of the smear against Jean Seberg. It did not need to arrive as a government accusation. It did not need a signature people could recognize. It did not need the solemnity of an official statement. It only needed to appear in print. First, as suggestion, then as repetition, then as something the public felt it had already heard. A blind item could do what a direct attack could not. It could move with the lightness of entertainment while carrying the weight of destruction. It could pretend not to name Jean while making her recognizable enough for the right readers to understand. It could turn a private pregnancy into a public guessing game, and a public guessing game into a stain. That is how gossip becomes more than gossip. It becomes atmosphere. People do not always remember where they first heard a rumor. They remember the feeling it left behind. A raised eyebrow, a question, a slight change in tone when a name is mentioned, a silence that arrives too quickly. For Jean, that atmosphere mattered. Her image depended on mystery, but not this kind. The mystery of Breathless had made her glamorous. The mystery of gossip made her vulnerable, and the cruelty was sharpened by race and politics. The rumor surrounding her pregnancy was not only meant to embarrass her as a woman, it was meant to attach her body to the political fear surrounding the Black Panther Party. It played on the prejudices of the era, the sexual anxieties of the public, and the old habit of punishing women by making their private lives seem dirty. That is why the attack was so precise. It did not say, Jean Seberg has political beliefs we dislike. It suggested something more intimate, more humiliating, more likely to travel. And because Jean was famous, the suggestion did not remain small. Her celebrity had once made her luminous across continents. Now it made the rumor portable. A whisper about an unknown person disappears. A whisper about a movie star multiplies. Soon, the story was no longer only a hidden maneuver inside government channels. It had entered the public space where Jean had to live, work, and breathe. Imagine the change in scale. A private woman can suffer a lie in a room. A public woman suffers it everywhere. In a restaurant, in an airport, on a set, in a magazine office. In the faces of people who think they know something because they read it somewhere. A rumor does not have to be believed by everyone to do damage. It only has to make certainty impossible. For an actress, that uncertainty is corrosive. Casting depends on trust. Publicity depends on image. Interviews depend on the illusion that the person speaking can still control what is being asked. But once the scandal enters the room first, every conversation is already contaminated. Jean Seberg had spent years being looked at as a symbol of modern freedom. Now she was being looked at as a scandal. That transformation is one of the most painful parts of her story because it shows how quickly admiration can turn into consumption. The same public that had loved her face now wanted access to her wound. The same press culture that had made her glamorous could also make her defenseless. And behind it all was the most intimate fact: she was pregnant. Not performing pregnancy, not playing a mother in a film, living through it. There is a particular violence in forcing a pregnant woman into public humiliation. The body is already changing. The future is already uncertain. Privacy matters because vulnerability is not theoretical. It is physical. It is daily. It is carried. For Jean, that vulnerability became part of the story others were telling about her. She could not separate the rumor from the child she was carrying. She could not separate the gossip from the fear, stress, and shame it created around her. Later accounts would connect this period to the deep emotional damage that followed. The exact shape of cause and consequence should be handled carefully, because a human collapse is never explained by one document alone. But the sequence is hard to ignore. The smear circulated. Jean endured public humiliation. She gave birth prematurely. The baby died soon after. And from that point on, something in the story becomes quieter, darker, more difficult to speak about without reducing her pain to a plot point. Because this was not simply reputational harm anymore. It was grief. A kind of grief that could not be separated from the fact that strangers had been invited into the most private region of her life. Even if one avoids claiming that the smear alone caused everything that came after, the emotional reality remains brutal. Jean Seberg had to carry a pregnancy under the shadow of a public lie, and then carry the loss that followed. That is not a scandal. That is a wound, and it changed the way her story should be told. If Jean Seberg had only been a victim of gossip columns, her story would still be cruel. But the known involvement of the FBI gives that cruelty a deeper architecture. It means the humiliation was not simply the accident of a hungry press. It was part of a political logic. A way to make a woman less credible, less admired, less useful to the people and causes she supported. The target was her influence. The method was her shame. And the cost was paid in a place no government file could fully measure. After the rumor, Jean's public image could not simply return to the clean lines of Breathless. The old photograph remained, of course. The cropped hair, the striped shirt, the Paris street. The young woman who seemed to belong to a freer world. But now another image existed beside it. A woman surrounded by whispers. A woman whose private life had been opened by force. A woman discovering that fame does not protect you from power. It can make power more interested in you. This is where the romance of the icon finally breaks. The world had once treated Jean Seberg as a symbol of escape. She had escaped the heavier glamour of old Hollywood. Escaped into European cinema. Escaped into an image that felt loose, spontaneous, unowned. But the file brought ownership back. It placed her under a system that did not care how free she looked on screen. It cared how she could be used off-screen. It took the woman who had seemed impossible to contain and tried to contain her inside one ugly story. And for a while, that story followed her more closely than any camera. After the rumor, Jean Seberg did not vanish from public life all at once. That is important. Real damage often looks less dramatic from the outside than people expect. There is no single frame where a life clearly breaks. No neat before and after line. No moment where the world stops and admits what has happened. Jean kept appearing. She kept working. She kept moving between countries, projects, rooms, and relationships. To someone watching from a distance, she might still have looked like Jean Seberg, the actress with the legendary face, the woman whose name belonged to cinema history. But the meaning of being seen had changed. Before, being seen had made her an icon. Now, being seen could feel like exposure. That is the aftershock of a smear campaign. It does not end when the article disappears from the page. It enters memory, it enters reputation, it enters the body. It changes how a person anticipates the next glance, the next question, the next whisper. For Jean, the harm was not only that something false and humiliating had been placed in public view. It was that the most private part of her life had been taken out of her hands. Once that happens, even silence is no longer fully private. A woman can retreat from reporters, but not from the knowledge that strangers have discussed her pregnancy. She can leave one country for another, but not from the feeling that her name has been altered in rooms she cannot enter. She can continue to work, but work itself cannot repair the wound of being made into a public object of suspicion. This is where Jean's story becomes harder to tell responsibly. It would be too simple to say that one memo caused every sorrow that followed. Human lives do not collapse because of one document alone. They are shaped by history, temperament, relationships, grief, illness, pressure, and time. But it would be just as false to pretend the campaign was only a footnote. The smear did not happen around Jean's life. It entered it. It entered at the point of pregnancy. It entered before loss. It entered through shame. It entered through the press. And after her baby died shortly after birth, the cruelty of that sequence became almost unbearable to look at directly. This is not the place for sensational detail. It is the place for proportion. Jean Seberg was a woman who had already been living under the exhausting pressure of image. She had been discovered young, projected onto early, admired intensely, misunderstood often. She had moved through film cultures that praised her face while not always protecting the person behind it. Then, at a vulnerable moment, a political operation found a way to turn her private life into an instrument of public humiliation. What followed was not a tidy Hollywood downfall. It was a long dimming. There were still films. There were still photographs. There were still moments where the old Jean appeared to flicker through elegant, alert, intelligent, impossible to reduce. But something around her name had darkened. The mythology of the French New Wave could preserve her youth, but it could not protect her present. That is one of the cruel ironies of movie immortality. Cinema can keep a face young forever, while the person attached to that face continues to suffer in real time. The public could replay Breathless and meet Jean again on the Champs, Élysées, light and restless, as if nothing had touched her. But the woman living beyond that image carried experiences the film could not show. The file, the rumor, the child, the grief, the knowledge that a powerful institution had looked at her, not as a citizen, not as an artist, but as a problem to be managed. And perhaps that is the emotional center of the story. Jean Seberg did not simply lose reputation. She lost safety inside her own image. The thing that had made her powerful, the public's fascination, had been turned against her. Her fame had once opened the world. Then it allowed a private wound to travel farther, faster, and with less mercy. In later years, as her struggles became more visible, people would search for explanations. Some would point to the FBI. Some would point to Hollywood. Some would point to the press. Some would point to grief or loneliness, or the hard instability of a life lived between countries and expectations. The truth may not fit inside one answer. But the paper trail does not let the powerful disappear from the story. That is why Jean Seberg cannot be remembered only as a tragic actress who could not survive fame. That version is too easy. It turns her suffering into atmosphere and leaves the machinery untouched. Her story asks for a sharper memory. It asks us to see how power can operate indirectly, how it can use newspapers instead of handcuffs, how it can injure a person not by removing her from the screen, but by changing what the public believes it sees when she appears there. And that reframe matters. Because for a long time, the public image of Jean Seberg carried two ghosts at once. One was the eternal image, the young woman in Paris, selling newspapers, beautiful because she seemed unpossessed. The other was the damaged image, the actress shadowed by scandal, rumor, and decline. But neither image was enough. One made her too effortless. The other made her too broken. Jean Seberg was not only a style icon, and she was not only a victim. She was a woman with convictions, contradictions, courage, vulnerability, and the terrible misfortune of becoming visible to a system that knew how to punish visibility. That is the story beneath the scandal. Not that Jean was fragile, but that the forces around her understood where fragility could be manufactured. And by the time the truth began to surface more clearly, the damage had already moved beyond headlines, beyond denials, beyond any simple public correction. The file could be opened. The campaign could be acknowledged. The old whispers could be traced backward. But a life does not return simply because the record is corrected. Jean Seberg was 40 years old when her body was found in Paris. By then, the girl from Breathless had already become a ghost in two different ways. On screen, she remained young forever. The haircut never changed. The Paris street never aged. The voice, the glance, the restless walk, all of it stayed preserved in the clean, bright memory of cinema. But outside the frame, time had not been so merciful. There had been years of strain, years of emotional difficulty, years in which the story of Jean Seberg became increasingly tangled with rumor, grief, politics, and the haunting knowledge that her private life had once been used against her by people who were never meant to be seen. When she died, the public could still reach for the familiar explanation: a tragic actress, a fragile star, a woman who could not survive the pressures of fame. Those phrases are easy, they sound sympathetic. They also protect the world from asking harder questions. Because Jean Seberg's life was not only a story of personal fragility, it was also a story of force. Pressure applied from outside. Pressure disguised as gossip. Pressure written in the language of files, and then released into the bloodstream of the press. After her death, the truth became harder to bury. The FBI's role in spreading the rumor about her pregnancy was acknowledged. What had once seemed like one of those ugly Hollywood whispers now had a paper trail behind it. The story had not simply floated up from nowhere. It had been encouraged, shaped, and placed. That revelation did not restore anything. It did not give Jean back the years of suspicion. It did not give her back the privacy of her pregnancy. It did not give her back the child she lost. It did not erase the way strangers had been invited to look at her with doubt. A correction can clarify history. It cannot repair a life. That is the quiet cruelty of Jean Seberg's ending. The truth arrived with documents, but Jean was no longer there to read herself back into the record. Others could explain what had happened. Others could name the machinery. Others could say that the smear had been real, that the campaign had been more than paranoia, that the whispers had not begun innocently. But the person most owed that vindication was gone. Romain Gary, who had known Jean not only as an icon but as a human being, publicly connected the FBI campaign to the damage she suffered. His words carried grief, anger, and the helplessness of someone trying to make the public understand that a rumor can become a weapon when power chooses to aim it. Still, even that cannot be the whole story. Jean Seberg should not be remembered only through the men who spoke after her, or the institutions that targeted her, or the tragedy that closed around her name. To reduce her to what was done to her would be another kind of theft. She was more than the file. She was more than the rumor. She was more than the final headline in Paris. She was an actress whose image helped define one of the most influential movements in modern cinema. She was a woman who crossed borders, languages, and expectations. She was admired, misunderstood, used, defended, watched, and remembered through fragments that never quite added up to a whole person. That incompleteness is part of why her story still hurts. The public knows the photograph. It knows the haircut. It knows the Paris street. It knows the coolness of the icon. But behind that image was someone far less convenient. A woman with convictions that made her visible to power, and a vulnerability that power learned how to exploit. This is what separates Jean Seberg's story from ordinary Hollywood tragedy. Hollywood can be cruel, fame can be cruel, the press can be cruel. But in Jean's case, cruelty became coordinated with political purpose. Her image was not merely damaged by appetite. It was damaged because someone understood that appetite could be useful. The audience did not need to know they were participating. They only needed to read. They only needed to whisper. They only needed to look at her differently. And in the end, that may be the most unsettling part of the story. A smear campaign does not always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like a column, a suggestion, a question about a woman's private life. A rumor repeated with enough confidence that the source disappears. By the time the machinery is visible, the person has already been changed by it. Jean Seberg's legacy now exists in that tension. She is still the face of Breathless, still the American girl on the Champs Elysees, still the symbol of a cinema that wanted to break rules and breathe differently. But she is also a warning about what can happen when a public woman refuses to remain decorative, when celebrity steps too close to politics, when the state decides that reputation is a battlefield, when the most intimate part of a person's life can be turned into evidence against her. The tragedy is not only that Jean Seberg suffered, it is that for so long, the public saw the suffering without seeing the system around it. They saw the actress decline. They did not see the hands that helped push the story. They saw the scandal. They did not see the file. And perhaps that is why the image from Breathless feels different now. The young woman in Paris still looks free. She still looks like she might disappear around a corner and begin another life. But we watch her with knowledge she did not yet have. We know that the world would keep looking. We know that not every gaze would be loving. We know that one day, the woman who seemed impossible to contain would be trapped inside a story written by others. Jean Seberg spent her life being seen. What she was denied, in the end, was the right to be fully known. In the end, Jean Seberg's story does not ask to be shouted. It asks to be heard carefully, because the temptation, with a life like hers, is to make the ending louder than the evidence allows. To turn pain into a slogan. To turn a woman into a symbol so quickly that she disappears again beneath another version of someone else's meaning. That would be the wrong way to remember her. Jean Seberg was not only the actress in the striped shirt, not only the woman in the FBI file, not only the victim of a smear campaign, not only the tragic figure found in Paris. She was all of those things, and also more than all of them. She was a young performer pushed into fame before she had time to understand its cost. She was a face that helped change the grammar of cinema. She was a woman drawn toward causes that mattered to her, at a moment when caring publicly could make a person dangerous to powerful men. She was watched, admired, misunderstood, exposed, wounded, and later vindicated in a way that came too late to feel like justice. That is the silence at the center of the story. The record can be corrected. The documents can be found. The language of the file can be read aloud. But no document can return privacy once it has been stolen. No admission can undo the first humiliation. No historical reframe can give a mother back the life she lost, or give a woman back the years she spent carrying a story she did not choose. So perhaps the most honest ending is not outrage, but recognition. Jean Seberg's face still survives in cinema, young and bright and restless. She still walks through Paris every time Breathless begins again. The camera still loves her. The image is still free. But now, when we look at her, we look differently. Not with the hunger of gossip, not with the simplicity of nostalgia, but with the knowledge that behind one of the coolest images in film history stood a real woman, and that real woman paid a price for being visible, for being political, for being vulnerable, and for living in a world where powerful people understood how easily a reputation could be turned into a weapon. Jean Seberg once seemed impossible to possess. Hollywood tried to frame her. Europe tried to immortalize her. The press tried to define her. The FBI tried to neutralize her. And still, something of her escapes. Not the scandal, not the file, not the rumor, the gaze. That direct, unsettled, unforgettable gaze, the one that made audiences feel she knew more than she was saying. Maybe that is why she endures. Because even after all the stories written over her, Jean Seberg still looks back. And this time, the story belongs to her.